Okay, it's now Thursday evening, about 10 minutes past 8 o'clock. So we're just going to make a start, even though I'm still expecting a few more students to join us. But I'm going to make a start with the recording so that we have this session recorded and available for anyone who did not get a chance to join in synchronous format. At least we will make this available, as I said, as a recording for you. So this week, it's week 12, I believe, of the semester. And this week we are really working on two things. And to discuss those, let me just jump into sharing my screen. And just about now, you should be seeing a version, a student preview view of our course. Again, the section might be different depending on which of my sections you're attending, but the learning modules will appear same in all of the sections of this class. So when we're at the learning modules and you scroll down for this week's material, which is the week 12, you'll notice that there's two things that I'm asking you to do this week. So we are completing our exam tree. And in addition, we're also working on our lab practical tree. So both of those cover the past 3 chapters, really. So we're going to be looking at the respiratory system, urinary system, and then finally the water, electrolyte, and pH balance. And in all transparency, I do want to be transparent and honest that there is less practical questions that we can ask from the final chapter, from the water, electrolyte, and pH balance, since that's more of a physiological take on expanding on what we saw with the urinary system physiology, kind of making it relevant to the entire body's scale, looking where the fluids are stored in the body, where the fluids are at one time, what is the effect on charged particles and electrolytes in general for the movement of the fluids, and finally considering a little bit about the pH range of the body and how we regulate that. So really the practical tree is going to be focusing heavily on the respiratory and urinary systems rather than on this final chapter that we have covered last week. Exam 3 instead does cover all 3, the respiratory, urinary, and water, electrolyte, pH balance chapters. So what I'm thinking that we're going to do today is that since I already had a morning session that I have recorded, I will simply link that morning session's recording to the end of this video. And during the morning session, one of the things that we did, we went through the study guide. And remember, all of the exam questions are pulled from the study guide. So study guide really is a valuable resource as you're preparing for the exam. One thing that you might remember from the study guide is that even though I provide the study guide itself will have gaps here and there. Whenever there's a gap or an empty space, it refers to an important term or an important concept that I really want you to be aware of. So this morning session spent the time going through this study guide, one section at a time, and kind of giving a really good briefing for you of all the things you should know when you're preparing for the exam tree. So with that all on our mind, I don't want to just repeat the same stuff that we've done. I think that it's going to be useful for us to do something different. If you are looking for a review of the study guide, just jump right to the end of this video. And there at the end, I have those links on the screen that you can click, and that will direct you to this morning's live online session where we reviewed this study guide. I do not post a completed study guide anywhere. It's not going to be available. You do have to attend to a review session, or you have to watch a review session recording to get those missing terms. I think that that's only fair in terms of I don't want to give you answers just as a complete documentation. You do need to take part on that activity of the review of the study guide. So that's going to be available for you on the recording from this morning. So what I thought that we're going to do instead this evening to make your time worthwhile, we'll have a look of a little bit of a different element of this week's material. And that's going to be preparing for the lab practical tree. And as you are getting ready to prepare for the lab practical tree, some students find it extremely useful to use the practice version of lab practical tree. So all of the questions that you might see in the lab practical tree are put into a larger of a pool of questions. And from that pool of questions is where we pull questions for the practice version of the practical. So as you're working your way through the practice version of the practical, you'll get to see some of the questions that will come up in the actual practical, which counts towards your final grade. I do remind that there are known points available for completing the practice practical, so that's completely voluntary, whether you feel that that's something that benefits you or if you feel that you're ready to go on to the real thing without practicing. However, if you end up choosing to use the practice version of the practical, one pointer that I would emphasize is that remember that the questions that you see on that practice practical are from that larger pool of questions. So it might be a good idea to play through that practice practical multiple times. And as you're playing through it, you will see new set of questions. And as you play through it enough times, you will have eventually seen every single possible question that might come up in the practical. So that's something that I encourage you to do if you feel that that's something that would benefit you. Of course, like I said, it's a completely optional thing that you can do, so I do not require you to do it, but like I said, many students find it useful. So that's what I was hoping to do today as we are doing this evening review session, to kind of have a look of some of the themes, some of the concepts that we might see on the practice version of the practical, and in this way practice for the lab practical that counts towards your final grade. So those are the only two assignments that I'm asking you to do this week. Both the exam and lab practical are due at the end of the week. So by the end of the Sunday, and let me just see, I believe Sunday is gonna be the 10th. So 1 minute before midnight, that's when they are due. I, of course, encourage you to make an early start just in case. And if you run into any technical issues, you know that all you have to do is reach out to me and we'll make sure that will get you up to speed and tackle any of those challenges. So what I'm going to do just for a second, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And I'm going to set us up for the practice practical, like I said. So let me just set it up. I can't do it from the preview view of a student. I have to actually log in as an instructor to get that open. So bear with me as I set it up. And I think what we're going to do, we're just going to play through it ourselves. The size of the pool of potential questions, I believe, is somewhere around 104 questions. So it's going to pull up about 50 of those in this practice version. So it gives you a good chance to see what's going on. So let me share my screen again so we can do this practice version together. And like I said, what you will see this time around are some of the questions from that larger pool. So it's not for certain that these are the exact questions, but it gives you a good idea of what might come up, how you should prepare for it. So here we're seeing first of these practice questions. There's going to be a structure that's highlighted there. And remember that in your actual practical, it's going to be largely, or I think it's all, filling box questions. So you will type in your answer. So there's no options, multiple choice options given to you. You simply will fill in the correct answer. Remember that I do not penalize you for spelling errors. As long as it makes sense, I always am very facilitating on that. And the other thing that I am open for giving you extra credit if you give me further information than just what I'm asking. So for example, on this picture, what we're seeing, we're being asked to identify what is this structure that's highlighted at the back of the oral cavity at the posterior most end of the soft palate. Remember, we had a hard palate, there was a bone, then we had soft palate, there was no bone, just soft tissue, and hanging from that, we had, of course, our uvula. Uvula will become very important, and we'll see more examples of that as we are discussing about the digestive system. Let's have a look at the next question, an example of that. Well, here we're seeing, like I mentioned, the soft palate, the floor of the nasal cavity or roof of the oral cavity, and this, in this case, this more posterior portion, that was, of course, soft palate. There was no bony structure within there. Let's have a look at the next question. We have highlighted structure from the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, and this highlighted structure is this protrusion you might remember, and I'm just simply gonna sketch it real quickly. From the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, we had these protrusions coming out, and these protrusions were known as conchi. So on the screen, on the diagram that I sketched, this dark and highlighted structure is now the lateral wall of the nasal septum. So these protrusions were known as our conchi, and in this case, what we're seeing, it's the middle one of these conchi that's highlighted. So if you want to be a little bit more specific. If you're wondering about the functions of the conchi, the first function was, of course, this structure allows us to increase the surface area of the nasal cavity. In addition, this shape facilitated generation of turbulence, so generating more flow of air to happen within this nasal cavity, so ensuring that a maximum amount of air rotates there, and in this way that as much of it as possible makes the contact with the nasal mucosa. But as always, if you're being asked for a name of a structure, the name of the structure alone is enough. Any other information is additional extra credit. Remember as well that more precise you are, more points you might get. On this model of a larynx, we have few structures highlighted. Let's have a look at those together. So here we have the epiglottis, the flap-like structure that came down when one swallowed either liquids or food, and in this way directed liquids or food to the oesophagus. At all other times, this epiglottis was standing upright, ensuring that the airway is maintained open. We also see the largest part of the laryngeal cartilages, or largest of the laryngeal cartilages, which is going to be our thyroid cartilage. Thyroid cartilage, you won't be surprised that the thyroid gland sits here in front of it. Thyroid cartilage has this very distinctive protrusion here, which is our laryngeal prominence, also known as the Adam's apple. And finally, the most inferior part of the larynx is going to be the cricoid cartilage. Cricoid cartilage is the only fully fused ring of the laryngeal cartilages. A few other things that we see on this picture that haven't been highlighted, we see the trachea with the tracheal rings. Those C-shaped structures, remember, they ensured that the trachea was kept, airway was kept open at all times. We also see the hyoid bone here. Both hyoid bone, thyroid cartilage, and cricoid cartilage, you can even feel on your own surface anatomy if you feel at the neck. The hyoid bone was kind of an important one, not definitely, but sometimes if someone gets strangled, that might get broken, so that might be something that we look at in a forensic use, but it's not definitely a black and white in terms of that. It certainly means that. Let's have a look of different structures of the nose. If I'm thinking of the structures of the nose, we are seeing the nose bridge, we're seeing dorsum nasi, we're seeing the apex of the nose. So remember, apex of the heart was pointing inferiorly, anteriorly, and to the left. So the sharp tip really is what we're meaning when we're talking about apex. In case of the lungs, do remember that the apex of the lungs is pointing to the very top portion. So in case of the lungs, is the most superior part. Again, the sharp tip. Apex of the lungs came all the way up to the level of clavicle and first rib bone. So that might be something to know. We're seeing the nasal septum. Nasal septum starting there. It divides the nasal cavity into left and right portions. Not necessarily often as symmetrical as these diagrams make us to think. I guess that the important part that I really want to highlight here is going to be, of course, our nares, our nostril, or nares, if you wish to use that term, that we're seeing here. So remember the functions of the nose. They were three-folded function, trapping any particles, especially the nasal cavity, trapping any particles that shouldn't get there, so cleaning the air. And we're seeing this starting already at the level of nostril with the hair at the nostril, so we're catching the biggest particles. Also the sticky inner layer of nasal cavity, the mucous membrane, that was great at trapping those particles that shouldn't get past there. In addition, of course, the humid environment, the sticky surface of the mucous membrane that humidifies the air before it gets down the respiratory tree. And finally, the rich blood supply, the capillary supply to the nasal cavity, that played an important role in bringing heat with the blood to this area. So we're warming up the air as well before it enters down the respiratory tree. Let's have a look of the next picture that we can see. Here we are seeing the same bone that we just discussed earlier on. You can sometimes even feel it on yourself. It's the hyoid bone. Remember, hyoid bone is one of these odd bones that are not directly connected to other bones, more rather held on its place with muscles and other soft tissues that kind of hold it where it is at, but there's very little of a direct bony connection with other bones that it could articulate with. Here we have a view from the top looking down of trachea, so the most anterior portion and most posterior portion. You see this C-shaped cartilage ring. The hyaline cartilage is the cartilage type that this C-shaped ring is made of. The function of that was to ensure that the airway is kept open at all time. One of the important structures on this diagram that we haven't really discussed a huge amount in face-to-face class, but you've seen in your practice anatomy, is this muscle that kind of connects the remaining open part of this C-shaped structure. It contracts or relaxes, kind of adjusting the airflow, the size of the trachea. This muscle is known as trachealis muscle. So trachealis muscle at the very back that we see here. Let's continue our discussion. Just a quick reminder, when we're talking about the cartilage and respiratory tree in general, the amount of cartilage decreases as we travel down the respiratory tree to primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi, and then bronchioles, and eventually to terminal bronchiole. So the amount of cartilage decreases, but the amount of smooth muscle increases as we travel down. Having said that, let's have a look at the next structure. So here we see our left lung highlighted. You'll notice how the left lung is significantly smaller than the right lung. This is because the heart takes much of the space on the left-hand side. We will also see that the left lung has two lobes, superior and inferior, separated by oblique fissures. So remember, oblique plane didn't align with the other planes that we've seen in our traditional X, Y, Z planes. It's kind of odd plane in terms of that. On the right lung, we're going to be seeing superior, middle, and inferior lobes separated by horizontal fissure. So the one that aligns with the horizon, separating the superior and middle lobe, and middle and inferior lobe separated again by an oblique fissure. Just in the name of transparency, I do want to mention that do remember, though, that a lot of the time there is more individual variation. If we have a large enough pool of individuals, we will end up seeing a differing number of lobes of the lung than what you're shown in these generalized reviews and generalized diagrams and models. Let's have a look at this nice diagram of structures of respiratory system. So we're seeing the nasal cavity, and we're actually seeing the concha within the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. We're seeing the hard palate, more anterior part of the palate. Remember, there's a bone inside. The posterior was soft palate. We're seeing our nostril. We're seeing also pharynx. Remember, pharynx was divided into three parts. Nasopharynx immediately behind the nasal cavity, oropharynx immediately behind oral cavity, and laryngopharynx above the larynx. We're also seeing our larynx, which was this set of cartilage structures, but also smooth muscles, other elastic tissues, and so on. Larynx often is described as the voice box, as it houses the vocal cords, vocal ligaments. One of the cartilages of the larynx that's highlighted here is the epiglottis. You remember that was open upright to keep the airway open at all other times except when you drink or eat liquidy foods, and it comes down, sealing off the trachea, directing that food down to esophagus that we can see part here on the back side. I think that that's a good review from that diagram. So let's move on and have a look of the next one. Here we're seeing again a view of the larynx, few important structures. We're seeing this epiglottis. So this is a side view, the front here, anterior side, posterior side here. So epiglottis, this flap-like structure, we just discussed about it. We saw earlier on also the thyroid cartilage, the most prominent, largest of the laryngeal cartilages. Here we're seeing the laryngeal prominence, the Adam's apple. We can see inside the thyroid cartilage, the vocal cords, running. Vocal cords are connected to our arytenoid cartilages, and arytenoid cartilages had muscles connecting them to them, which then help to change the kind of position of arytenoid cartilages, and this way altering the tension of the vocal cord. At the very top of the arytenoids, we have our corniculate cartilages, the very fine tips on top of those, and we have our cricoid cartilage, the most inferior part of the larynx, only fully enclosed fused ring. And then we had our cuneiform cartilages within the wall structures, within the soft tissue, often not really themselves visible on these models that we look at. So let's have a look at the next one. Next, we're seeing the lower respiratory tract. Let's see all the things that we can see there. We're seeing the trachea coming down. At the point of the hilum, trachea divides into right primary bronchi and left primary bronchi. You'll also notice the difference in the angle of these two. We're seeing the left lung and we're seeing the right lung, and they could be divided left into superior and inferior lobe, and then the right to superior, middle, and inferior lobe. Notice how lungs go down far on the lateral sides. You're also seeing very nicely in this dissected view the diaphragm, the skeletal muscle sheet that separates the thoracic cavity from abdominal cavity there. Let's continue our review of the material and have a look what else are we seeing. So we're seeing quite a bit on this diagram. Remember, apex was the peak. So in this case, for the lungs, it's the most superior portion. We're seeing the horizontal fissure running more along to the line of horizon, and we're also seeing the oblique fissure there. We're seeing the superior lobe, middle lobe, and inferior lobe. Base of the lung rests against the diaphragm. I think that there's quite a few good structures on that diagram. Let's have a look of what we're seeing here. We're seeing the hard palate, so the most anterior portion of the palate, called hard palate because there's a bony structure within it. Next one, what we're seeing is gonna be the various different structures that are anatomical features of the nose. Notice the only bone that we see there, the nasal bone, rest our cartilages. Well, we see our lateral cartilages on the sides, and then we can see multiple other cartilages that contribute to the nose. If someone gets a nose job and there's a lot of things that have been going on, we might need additional cartilage that we can harvest from other parts of the body. Here we see another nice diagram of the larynx, this time looking from the back. We see the thyrohyoid ligament, which really connects the thyroid cartilage to the hyoid bone. We're seeing the thyroid cartilage. We're seeing the corniculates on the top of the arytenoids, and we're seeing the cricoid cartilage. Notice how we're seeing here the epiglottis, the flap-like disc as well. We're seeing the tracheal cartilage, those C-shaped cartilage rings that we just saw earlier on. So quite a lot going on that image, and a good image to be familiar with. This next one I really wanted to talk a little bit about because it shows this space between the conchi. So you remember the conchi from earlier on, but now the space on the lateral wall of the nasal cavity between the conchi. This space is going to be called meatus. And since it's going to be the one in the middle, it's going to be called middle nasal meatus, or middle meatus of the nasal cavity. Let's have a look of the other ones. Here we're seeing the right lung. I think we revised that earlier on. So superior, middle, and inferior lobe. Superior and middle separated by our horizontal fissure, and middle and inferior separated by our oblique fissure. Left one only had superior and inferior lobe separated by oblique fissure because heart took some of that space within there. Let's have a look at the next one. Again, we're seeing structures of the larynx, another good diagram, epiglottis peeking out from there behind the hyoid bone. We're seeing the our laryngeal prominence, also known as Adam's apple, and then trachea continuing from underneath there. Notice those C-shaped tracheal rings. Here we're seeing a familiar structure that we've already discussed about. Another one of these conchae, it's going to be the bottom one. So it's going to be the inferior conchae or inferior nasal conchae, if you wish to use that naming convention. Let's have a look at the anterior view of the respiratory tract. What we can see there, we are seeing the pleura that surrounded the lungs. We're seeing the right lung. We're seeing horizontal fissures separating the different lobes of the right lung. Notice how much larger the right lung is, whereas left lung much smaller because the heart took such a big part of that. You're seeing the cardiac notch there, the indentation left by the heart onto the left lung. We're also seeing the parietal pleura and visceral pleura of those layers surrounding the lungs. This one not too different from what we've discussed before with the nasal meduses, this time just the inferior one. So inferior nasal medus. Let's have a look at the next one, a nice model of the respiratory tract. So we're seeing our trachea. It divided at the carina into primary bronchi, then followed by secondary bronchi, and finally tertiary bronchi and bronchioles. Let's continue our review. What we're going to see next, I think that this is a nice one. It shows both left and right superior lobes. So remember, on the right side, we're going to have also middle and inferior lobe, whereas on the left side, only superior and inferior lobes. Let's continue our review. What we're going to see here is a diagram that we've discussed already before. So we're seeing our trachea at the carina divided into the primary bronchi, and then further secondary, tertiary, and bronchioles. What else are we seeing? We're seeing the costal surface, which is the surface of the heart that's against the rib cage. So we're going to see the costal surface at the anterior, lateral, and a little bit on the posterior side as well. We're seeing very nicely that on this diagram. So the costal surface refer to all of the surface that's against the ribs when it comes to the lungs. Here on this picture, we're seeing at the back of the nasal cavity our tonsil, pharyngeal tonsil. You'll also see nicely on this picture the opening of the auditory meatus, the connection to the inner ear from the nasal cavity there as well. Let's continue our review of structures. We're seeing few important structures when it comes to the kidney. So we're seeing how urine was produced within the medulla of the kidneys, and then that was collected by minor followed by major calyxes, and then kind of funneled further. So these are our major calyxes that have been highlighted. Next, we're seeing more urinary system structures. So let's start with the kidney. From the kidney, we're seeing those minor calyxes that feed into the major calyxes, that feed into the renal pelvis. Renal pelvis is kind of this funnel-shaped structure collecting the urine, and then it travels down the ureter to the urinary bladder. I think that that's a good review of some of the important things that we're seeing here. Let's continue our journey. What else can we see? We're seeing our kidney. And remember, with the kidney internal structure, we had the cortex, which was the outer portion of the inner kidney. And then we had our renal medulla for the more inner structures. Within here, we're seeing the renal pyramids, these kind of triangular structures, and renal columns in between them. We're also seeing the minor and major calyces, renal pelvis, and ureter. Another thing to notice, there's a rich blood supply coming to the kidney, so we have our renal artery and renal vein as well to notice there. Let's have a look at more of the renal structures. So we're seeing now renal vein leaving the kidney. It's vein, so it's gonna be blue in most models, and in this case it's gonna be from the right side, so it's gonna be the right renal vein. Let's have a look at the next picture. Here we're seeing urinary system, kind of a nice diagram. So we're seeing the kidneys. Notice how left kidney is higher up than the right kidney. That's because the liver takes the space immediately above the right kidney. We're also seeing the adrenal glands or suprarenal glands that we remember from our endocrine system review on top of the kidneys. We're seeing ureter leaving the kidneys, traveling to the urinary bladder, and finally out from urinary bladder, the urethra. Notice how ureters join the urinary bladder at the base. Not from the top like students often think, but from the base. And that brings us to talk about, if we look at the urinary bladder, there's going to be three openings. More posteriorly at the base are ureters, and more anteriorly are urethra, which was the passageway to the external world to eliminate the urine. So if I show you this diagram that I just quickly sketched, you'll notice that this arrangement of the two ureters and one urethra generates this kind of a triangular structure at the base of the urinary bladder. That's known as our trigone. And trigone is an important anatomical landmark if you do any medical imaging on this area. Let's continue our review a little bit further and see what else we can see. So here we're seeing connecting the kidney to the bladder, our ureter, and in this case, it's going to be the left ureter. Let's continue onwards. We're seeing here a little bit of a microscopy of the renal corpuscle. So I'll leave that for you. Remember the glomerulus, the capillary shaft, and glomerular capsule, capsular space that we're seeing here, including the Bowman's capsule here. I think that a very, very good microscopic image to have a look. Those were covered on your practice anatomy. Continuing onwards, we're seeing another nice diagram of the kidney. We're seeing the renal cortex, the superficial portion of the inner parts of the kidney, and renal medulla, the innermost parts of the kidney. We're seeing various vessels. Let's have a look at that. We're seeing the renal artery and vein entering from the medial aspect, from this concave aspect to the kidney. There's also going to be nerves. There's also going to be lymphatic vessels and so on. We're seeing the segmental artery, interlobal artery and vein, and cortical radiate artery and vein. And finally, arcuate artery and vein. Notice that pay attention always to the color of the vessel, whether we're talking about artery or the vein. So a very, very nice diagram for you to be familiar with. What we're seeing here is actually, even though it's a cross section, we're highlighting this outermost layer around the kidney, which is going to be the fibrous capsule surrounding the kidney. Let's continue our review. Here we're seeing a nice simple structure highlighted. This is of course going to be our urinary bladder, a muscular hollow organ where the urine is stored until we're ready to expel it from the body. Here, what we see, we have highlighted the renal medulla. So similar to those diagrams that you saw before, the innermost parts. Remember, within renal medulla, we had our renal pyramids. and between the pyramids we had the renal columns. Let's continue onwards and see other structures that we're seeing here. Very nice picture. We're seeing renal vein. Notice it's going to be the blue vessel, and renal artery, the red vessel, both entering to the kidney from the medial aspect. Leaving from the renal artery, we're going to see our segmental artery. And then kind of moving our way further, we're going to see accurate vessels and interlobar vessels, and interlobar or cortical radiate vessels. So a lot of good stuff there to notice on this picture. Let's keep looking. Here we're simply seeing the renal cortex having been highlighted, so the outermost portion of the kidney. Let's keep going on and have a look of the external anatomy of the kidney. You'll notice how the kidney has this fibrous capsule around it, giving it this shiny appearance. We're also seeing the renal artery and renal vein entering to the kidney. It's often a good sign to look for the adipose tissue around those that might be helpful. Renal hilum, referring to this concave area on the medial aspect of the kidney. And of course, we're seeing the renal pelvis, which was this kind of funnel-like structure that collected the urine from first minor and then major calyces and carried it out to the ureter. Let's continue our review. What we're going to see here is going to be our ureter, this time on the right-hand side. So right ureter there. Continuing onwards, other things that we might see, we're seeing that renal pyramid that I've spoken about before. Between the renal pyramids, we're also seeing the renal columns. We're seeing minor calyx and major calyx. So minor calyces feed into the major calyces, collecting the urine that was produced. We're seeing the renal column that I've referred a few times here between the renal pyramids. So renal column lays in between the renal pyramids at the medial parts of the kidney. Let's continue onwards, have a look what comes up next. We're seeing those minor calyxes that collected the urine, fed into major calyxes here. So another good view of the same structures that we've discussed before. We're being asked here to identify this area on the medial aspect of the kidney. It's going to be our renal hilum. So a good structure to be familiar with. Renal columns, I've mentioned them on diagrams before. Now we're seeing a real kidney dissection, so the spaces between the renal pyramids. So renal columns nicely shown there. Let's have a look at the next picture. Here another nice model of the kidney. Few things there to notice: the renal capsule, the connective tissue layer around the kidney. We're seeing renal pyramids, so remember those kind of triangular structures in the renal medulla, and of course the outermost portion of the kidney, renal cortex. We're also seeing our minor and major calyces feeding into renal pelvis, and finally to ureter, which then connects to the urinary bladder. We're seeing all that stuff going on there nicely. Here, an easy one, simply identifying that it's going to be a kidney, and it's going to be, in this case, the left kidney that we're seeing on this one. Let's keep going on and see what other structures we're seeing. We're seeing this similar view to what I sketched to you earlier on during this revision of the urinary bladder. Notice how the wall of the urinary bladder is muscle. It's detursor. So the muscularis layer of the bladder consists of 3 layers of smooth muscle, the detursor muscle there. We're also seeing the urethral openings, so two uretras of opening on the base of the urinary bladder, more on posterior aspect, and then of course we're seeing the structure, the trigon formed by these 3 openings there. I think of with the urethra being the more anterior one and leading out from the urinary bladder to the outside world. Another thing, I'm going to jump just back in here to point out, notice how the wall of the urinary bladder has these bumpy appearance. These are known as a rugae. We're going to end up seeing rugae also in the stomach. So they're what gives it kind of this bumpy appearance. They facilitate that the structure can extend and shrink. So kind of give us this chance of changing the size based on the needs. Let's have a look at the next view. We're seeing a model of the kidney nicely. So let's start unpacking. We're seeing the renal cortex, the outermost layer, and renal medulla, the innermost layer. We're seeing the renal pyramids, these kind of more of a triangular structures, darker tissue, between them renal columns. We're seeing the minor calyces feeding to major calyces, and then through renal pelvis to the ureter. We've discussed those structures already earlier during this revision. Here, we're simply seeing the kidney, this time on the right-hand side, having highlighted. Notice your adrenal glands, or also known as suprarenal glands, on top of the kidneys. Final one that I have for this time around, an actual kidney dissection. We're seeing the renal cortex, the outermost layer. We're seeing the renal pyramid, those triangular structures, darker tissue. We're seeing the renal columns between the renal pyramids, and then the minor major calyces, renal pelvis. What else could we see? Renal sinus there. Renal medulla, remember, covered a lot of the inner structures. So that about completes our review of some of the questions that could come up in your practical. Of course, these are 50 questions from a larger pool of about 100. So it's not a definite that it's exactly these questions, but it kind of gives you an idea what to anticipate. And I'm simply going to jump back as we're wrapping up this session. And I'm going to jump back to our view of this week's learning module. So finally, as a reminder, remember that what I'm asking you to do this week are two things. I'm asking you to complete the exam, and remember that the exam questions were from the completed study guide, and I'm asking you to complete the lab practical. Both cover 3 chapters: respiratory system, urinary system, and water electrolyte pH balance. To practice for the lab practical 3, please feel free to work through the lab practical 3 practice. You can work through it as many times as you wish, a good way to prepare. And you'll find the blank version of the study guide also at the lecture study resources. Like I said, I went through it both in in-person class and this morning as a live online session, which recording I will link to the end of this video. And having said all that, that completes everything that I had planned for us for this evening session. Since we don't have questions popping up from participants, we're simply going to wrap up here at this time. And I'm going to wish you very good luck with your exam 3 and practical 3. And as always, I'm only a message away. Canvas is really the quickest way to get hold of me if you run into any technical issues or you have questions. And otherwise, make sure you get the exam 3 and practical 3 in by the end of this week, and by the end of the Sunday. And you're in a great place with that. I hope you have a very good rest of the evening. I hope you have a very good rest of the week. And otherwise I don't hear from you, I will see you next week at our usual class meeting time. At that time, we'll start a new chapter. We're going to be looking at digestive system. Until then, have a good night. Take care of yourself, and make sure you take some time also to enjoy the weekend. Thank you. Bye.